Hey guys, Yips here coming at you from the video, and today I want to take a little bit of time to talk about Roll the Bones for Outlaw Rogue. Roll the Bones is easier to understand than ever before, and I have a little bit of a different way of thinking about it this expansion than I did previously. This is because of the loaded dice talent and how that functions with Adrenaline Rush, and because there are so many good buffs for Outlaw Rogue now. There's really only truly one bad 2 buff that you can roll as Outlaw now. There are 2 that are mediocre, but 14 out of the 15 2 buffs that you could possibly get are very, very good. This means that more often than not, you're going to be very happy when you're rolling your 2 buffs, and because you're doing it so frequently with the high uptime of AR, spending a lot of finishers, Roll the Bones is something that is more of a maintenance buff than something that's RNG and you have to be thinking about as much as previously, which I think is a really good thing and a really good design space for Outlaw Rogue. Before I get into anything rotationally and discussing my philosophy on how I think about it this expansion, let's talk about the rules around Roll the Bones in terms of rolling a single buff and a 2 buff. So first we'll talk about single buffs. With single buffs as Outlaw Rogue, it's easy to understand. You have 2 categories. You have the GG category, and then you have the rest of them. If you're in GG, that means you're rolling Broadside, Skull and Crossbones, or True Bearing. As a single buff, you are not going to roll over the GG category. If you're in the OK or the bad, i.e. you're rolling Ruthless Precision, Buried Treasure, or GRANDMELEE, you are going to roll over those. If you ever have loaded dice in a single buff, this overwrites everything I said and you're just going to hit Roll the Bones. Loaded dice active, single buff, hit Roll the Bones. Very easy to understand with single buffs. There are only 2 categories. Now, if you roll a 2 buff, the way that I like to think about it is I separate it into another 2 categories like this, and like this. If you roll Ruthless Precision plus one of the GG buffs, or any of the GG buffs together, you are never going to re-roll that. If you roll Ruthless Precision plus anything on the bad side, with Buried Treasure or GRANDMELEE, or these 2 together, you're going to re-roll it if you have loaded dice. If you have Buried Treasure and GRANDMELEE together, those are still the garbage buff as Outlaw, you're always going to re-roll them. That's the only case where you have a 2 buff without loaded dice that you're going to re-roll it, but that's been standard for a long time now, so that shouldn't be any new news. The only other thing to think about is if you have GG plus bad, you are never going to re-roll that. Okay? So any of these GG buffs, anytime you roll Broadside, Skull and Crossbones, and True Bearing with any of the others, you're never going to re-roll. The only time you're re-rolling a 2 buff is if you roll GRANDMELEE and Buried Treasure, or if you have loaded dice active and you have Ruthless Precision plus one of these 2. Okay? So there really aren't that many categories to understand. It's a lot easier than before, and I'll leave a little description down below on exactly the rules, just so when you want to refresh yourself about them, you just have a little info that you can just quickly read in 30 seconds comparing to have to watch the video. So, with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about my philosophy around the Roll the Bones and how I implement it into my rotation and what I'm really thinking about as I go through my gameplay. So with Roll the Bones, I tend to think about it as cycles between my Adrenaline Rush. And what I mean by that is since every time I hit Adrenaline Rush, it gives me the guarantee match or 2 match on my next Roll the Bones, I think about how many buffs am I going to have to roll before my Adrenaline Rush is back. Basically, am I getting it back in this buff, or am I going to have to wait for my next one? So, as Outlaw, you want to be thinking about, if I roll True Bearing, it's extremely likely that my next roll is going to include the use of Adrenaline Rush. If I don't have True Bearing, it's very likely that if I just use my Adrenaline Rush, I'm going to have to roll 1 or 2 more times before it is back active. And these are the cycles that you want to be thinking about as you're playing Outlaw, instead of just thinking, okay, I have buffs active now, when do I roll, what do I do, what's going on? You just want to think about it as between your AR cycles, how many times are you going to be rolling, and how that's going to function for you. At least that's how I do it. So the way this functions for me is at the start of combat, always I have AR at the very beginning of any sort of encounter, and I'm getting ready to use my Roll the Bones buff. I'm going to get in combat right away here because it's crucial that I use CDR to kind of showcase this, but with AR and Roll the Bones, here I got my True Bearing. Now what that means is it's very, very likely that within 1 or 2 rolls, I'm going to be able to farm back that AR before this buff is gone. And if you're playing the Keep It Rolling build, This is going to happen a lot more frequently because of count the odds. So what you can see here is that between this buff and the ending of this buff, if I wasn't using globals on Blade Flurry, I would have had my AR back by the time it was over. But this is going to be a 1 cycle where I have to roll the bones once before my AR is back, so I don't even think about this buff that I give because it's a single buff. My AR is back, roll again. Okay, I got True Bearing again. We're in combat, let's fight. See what happens here. See how long it takes me to get my Adrenaline Rush back, and because I rolled True Bearing, I know that it's going to be most likely just a single roll between, or I might get it back within this duration. And that should sort of be always your goal on Outlaw Rogue, is to try to farm back that AR as quickly as possible. So you can see here that within this buff, I'm pretty much going to farm back that Adrenaline Rush, which is why I said you have to be aware that when you are rolling, and here I wouldn't roll the bones, I would wait for my AR to come back up. If it's within 1 combo point spender, I would always do that. Always be aware of how many cycles it's going to be before your next AR. So I just hit my 2 buff here. Now I know, since I didn't roll True Bearing, that when these fade, I'm going to have to hit at least 1 or 2 rolls before I get back into that window. And I know I'm not playing my rotation here perfectly. It's because I'm talking about what I'm focusing on. However, the rules stay the same. So when this buff fades, I know that my next roll, I'm not going to have AR. It's going to be a single buff, which is fine. I will roll. I get True Bearing, which means my Roll the Bones buff back is, or sorry, my Adrenaline Rush is going to come back very quickly, and I'm going to be back into that cycle. So my AR will come back during this. If I didn't roll True Bearing, it would have probably taken a little bit longer than this. However, here we are, existing. And there is my Adrenaline Rush, and I'm going to use it again, and Roll the Bones. That's how I think about my Roll the Bones as I'm playing Outlaw Rogue, is whenever it's not active, how long between my rolls is going to be before it becomes active again. And I know that when I roll True Bearing, it's going to be an extremely quick cycle between, and then when I don't have True Bearing, it's going to take a little bit longer before I'm back into that 2 buff window. And since 2 buffs are often so good, you're very frequently going to be in that cycle. Keep It Rolling is just going to add a little consistency to that with things like Count the Odds, with Improved Adrenaline Rush, and Keep It Rolling. Obviously, since you're able to extend your buffs for longer periods of time, you're able to do more with it. That means you're going to be in that loaded dice window for a little bit longer. If you're curious about some cool things that you can do with Roll the Bones, I would recommend checking out the Keep It Rolling video. At the very end, I touch a little bit about how to abuse this loaded dice with Keep It Rolling and how you can extend your Keep It Rolling buffs for a little bit longer. Something that I would recommend you look at. And what I'm going to do just for the end of this video for a couple minutes is just going to fight the dummies, and you guys can really see how I use Roll the Bones when I am focused. So I'm going to play the Keep It Rolling build here to showcase that. And it's worth noting with Keep It Rolling, you want to roll at least 3 of the either good or okay buffs when you use the Keep It Rolling. And before I get into this, I'm just going to farm back my Adrenaline Rush. So for those of you who just want to see a little gameplay with it, I'm going to showcase that here. So let me just farm back my Adrenaline Rush, and then we'll get into combat and talk a little bit about it. And I'll do some brief comments as I'm going through my rotation, but for the most part, I'm just going to try to stay focused so I play it properly. Okay, so here's my AR back. Alright, so let's do it. So as always, I'm focused on my first 2 buff and what that means for me, and I'm always trying to bait out additional buffs so I can use my Keep It Rolling, and you'll see when I hit 3 good buffs how I'm going to be managing that. So you see there, I got 3 good buffs right off the bat with my Stealth Opener, so I'm going to extend that. And this is the situation where I'm talking about, where I'm going to get an AR before this is faded, which means I'm going to be able to do the quirky thing where I extend this. So I'm not even thinking about Roll the Bones right now because I know I have good buffs for a long period of time. So here I get my loaded dice. What I can do is once my CTO procs fade, is I can roll over this if I want to To extend it, I'm going to do it at the very end because I like having True Bearing. If it wasn't True Bearing, I would have most likely done this a little bit earlier. True Bearing is an excellent buff. And you can see I can overlap my buffs just a little bit here to get a 4 buff for a brief period of time with that loaded dice. And this 2 buff is working out very well for me because I'm going to get my loaded dice back up before it fades, which is very good, which is what I want. And a lot of the time when you're playing the Keep It Rolling build, you're going to be going 2 buff into 2 buff into 2 buff into 2 buff. Here I roll a very bad buff, and it's good to showcase those as well. When you roll these very bad buffs, it's most likely, oh, maybe a moment here. Nope. I could have kept it rolling there maybe if I got a little bit more lucky. So my Roll the Bones is back. I get a natty good 2 buff. Now I'm looking to use Keep It Rolling. I get a Ruthless Precision. That's a good buff. I'm going to wait one more global. I'm going to extend it. Would have been nice to get that extra finisher in to get that True Bearing, but it's okay. Here's another situation where I'm going to have my loaded dice, my rotation. And at the very end of this, I'm going to be able to extend these buffs. Now normally you wouldn't be playing Audacity with Keep It Rolling, I just didn't change that talent point, so I'm just using it rotationally as I would if I was playing it. So once these CTO proc fades, I'm now in a situation where if I want to, I can overwrite this 2 buff by either extending it or adding additional buffs with my loaded dice. I'll showcase that here. Boom, add 2 rolls to it with that. It's a little bit RNG. Sometimes that won't happen, but often it will. You can only do that after you keep it rolling, and it's up to you whether you want to take the risk of extending that 2 buff and wasting a little bit of your loaded dice, or adding 2 additional buffs. And it's going to be situational. It is a bug, but it's something that we can use for now. You can see I did it again there. And you can see how, if you're rolling well, how short that keep it rolling window really is. Alright, so that's how we use Roll the Bones. You can see very frequently that I'm in that one cycle where I'm just going 2 buff to 2 buff to 2 buff to 2 buff. And that's how Outlaw Rogue works with Keep It Rolling. With Shadow Dance, you're pretty much always going to have one intermediary roll between your Adrenaline Rush, and if you're getting unlucky, sometimes it will be 2. So that's how I think about Roll the Bones. That's how I work it with my build. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments below. I'll try to get to it and answer on how it functions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.